A 13-year-old boy stood alone in court, accused of theft, when an elderly woman burst through the doors. Everyone gasped at what she revealed about him. Ray's alarm buzzed at 5:30 a.m., same as every morning. The 13-year-old's long fingers fumbled to silence it before the sound could wake his grandmother in the next room. Their cramped Brooklyn apartment walls were thin, too thin to risk any extra noise. He sat up in his twin bed, rubbing sleep from his eyes. The springs creaked under his skinny frame as he reached for the old t-shirt he'd laid out the night before. Through the window, the sky was still dark, but the first hints of dawn painted the edges of the buildings outside. "Grandma?" Ray called softly, patting down the narrow hallway to her room. "Time for your medicine." A weak cough answered him. "I'm awake, baby." Ray found her propped up against her pillows. Her breathing labored. The diabetes was getting worse, even though neither of them talked about it. He counted out her morning pills with practiced care, arranging them in a little plastic organizer they'd gotten from the free clinic. "Here you go." He helped her sit up straighter, handed her the pills and a glass of water. His stomach clenched as he noticed how shaky her hands were today. "You're such a good boy," she whispered, patting his arm. "Don't you worry about me. Get yourself ready for school." Ray nodded, but worry was a constant weight in his chest these days. The pile of unpaid bills on the kitchen counter kept growing. Her disability checks barely covered rent and utilities, let alone food and medicine. In the kitchen, he fixed her usual breakfast, plain oatmeal with a sprinkle of cinnamon, the way she liked it. While it cooled, he checked the grocery money jar hidden behind the cookie tin. Only $23 left for the week. The local grocery store, Miller's Market, opened at 7 a.m. Ray had worked out a deal with Mr. Miller months ago. He'd help the elderly customers with their bags in exchange for a few dollars here and there. It wasn't much, but every bit helped. "Grandma, breakfast is ready," he called out, carrying the bowl to her room. "I'm heading to Miller's before school." She looked up from her worn Bible, worry lines creasing her forehead. "You're not eating?" "Had a banana already," he lied smoothly. The truth was, they couldn't afford breakfast for both of them this week. Not after buying her insulin. The morning air was crisp as Ray hurried down the cracked sidewalk toward Miller's Market. His worn sneakers, 2 sizes too big and found at the church donation bin, slapped against the concrete. A police car cruised by slowly, and Ray kept his eyes down, hands visible, just like his grandmother had taught him. The store's fluorescent lights hummed as he pushed through the front door. Mrs. Miller, the owner's wife, was already at the register. "Morning, Ray," she called out cheerfully. "Got some heavy bags that need carrying today?" "Yes, ma'am." Ray smiled, grateful for the work. He'd been coming here so long, Mrs. Miller sometimes slipped him an extra apple or day-old bread that would have been thrown out anyway. The morning passed in a blur of grocery bags and thank yous from elderly customers. By the time he needed to leave for school, he'd earned $8. Less than usual, but better than nothing. "Here you go, son." Mrs. Miller pressed the wrinkled bills into his hand. "You're doing good work." Ray's "thank you" caught in his throat as he counted the money. It wouldn't be enough. The pharmacy had called yesterday. His grandmother's prescription was ready, but it would cost $35 after insurance. They were still $12 short. The walk to school felt longer than usual, his feet heavy with worry. In his backpack, the same 3 notebooks from last semester were falling apart. His teachers had started commenting on his lack of supplies, but new notebooks weren't even on the list of priorities right now. His phone buzzed, an old model his grandmother had gotten him for emergencies. The school's number flashed on the screen. "Hello, Mr. Williams?" The secretary's voice was clipped. "This is Ms. Peterson from administration. We need to discuss your ongoing issues with school supplies. Your teachers have reported." "I understand," Ray cut in, his voice tight. "I'll figure something out." That night, after helping his grandmother to bed, Ray sat on the edge of his mattress, head in his hands. The day's earnings sat on his desk next to the pharmacy reminder note. In the quiet darkness, he could hear his grandmother's wheezing through the wall. Tomorrow would be another early morning. Another day of trying to stretch dollars that wouldn't stretch far enough. Another day of watching his grandmother pretend she wasn't in pain. Ray lay back, staring at the water stains on the ceiling. He was 13 years old, and sometimes it felt like the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. But he'd keep carrying it, What other choice did he have? The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, a familiar Brooklyn lullaby. Ray turned onto his side, curling into himself. Tomorrow would be another day of trying to keep their fragile world from falling apart. He just hoped he was strong enough to hold it together. The next morning started like any other at Miller's Market. Ray had just finished helping Mrs. Chun with her groceries when the store's bell chimed. He didn't think much of it until he heard heavy footsteps behind him. "Hey you, don't move." Ray froze, his hand still on the door. Two police officers approached, their boots loud against the linoleum floor. The taller one had his hand on his holster. "Turn around slowly. Hands where we can see them." Ray's heart hammered in his chest as he obeyed. The fluorescent lights seemed too bright suddenly, making him squint. "What's wrong, officers?" "Shut up." The shorter cop grabbed Ray's arm, spinning him to face the wall. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "What? I didn't do anything." Ray's voice cracked. Cold metal bit into his wrists as handcuffs clicked into place. Mrs. Miller burst out of her office. "What's going on here?" "That's Ray. He works for us." "Ma'am, stay back," the taller officer ordered. "This individual is suspected of theft from multiple stores in the area." "That's impossible," Mrs. Miller protested. "He's been helping our customers all morning." They ignored her. Ray felt hands searching his pockets, removing his old phone and the $8 he'd earned that morning. "Evidence," the shorter cop declared, dropping them into a plastic bag. "Please," Ray's voice shook. "I need to call my grandmother. She's sick. She needs her medicine. You can make your call at the station." They marched him outside, past morning shoppers who stopped to stare. Ray caught glimpses of their faces, shock, judgment, indifference. His cheeks burned with shame. The back of the police car was cold and smelled like cleaning solution and something else, something sour. Ray's shoulders ached from his arms being pulled back. Through the window, he watched his neighborhood disappear, street by street. At the station, they took his fingerprints and a mug shot. The camera flash made spots dance in his vision. "Name?" The desk sergeant barely looked up from his computer. "Raymond James Williams." "Age?" 13. That made the sergeant pause. 13? He glanced at the arresting officers. "Why isn't he in juvenile?" "Orders from up top," the taller cop said. "DA wants him processed as an adult." String of robberies in the area, all same MO. Ray's stomach dropped. Adult court? He'd heard stories about teenagers tried as adults. None of them ended well. They put him in an interrogation room. Metal table, 2 chairs, mirror on one wall that Ray knew was probably a window on the other side. His handcuffs were attached to a ring on the table. Minutes stretched into hours. Ray's arm cramped. His throat was dry. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his grandmother waiting at home, wondering where he was. Finally, the door opened. A tired-looking man in a rumpled suit entered, carrying a thin file. "Raymond Williams? I'm Mr. Peters, your public defender." He sat heavily in the chair across from Ray. "You've been charged with multiple counts of theft. The evidence." "I didn't steal anything." Ray leaned forward, making the handcuffs rattle. "I work at Miller's Market. I help old people with their groceries. You can ask Mrs. Miller." Peters held up a hand. "Save it for now. They're processing your release papers. You'll be fitted with an ankle monitor and confined to a 5-block radius of your home." "But how will I work? How will I help my grandmother?" "That's not my concern right now." Peters shuffled through the papers. "Your preliminary hearing is next week. The DA's office is pushing for adult court. Given the nature of the accusations." "What accusations?" "I haven't done anything wrong." Peters sighed, rubbing his temples. "Multiple witnesses describe a young black male, tall, thin, matching your description, stealing from stores in the area. Security footage shows someone of similar build. The DA thinks they have a strong case." Ray felt like he couldn't breathe. The room was too small, the lights too bright. "Please, I need to call my grandmother." After what felt like another hour, they finally let him make the call. His hand shook so badly he misdialed twice. "Grandma?" His voice broke when she answered. "Ray? Baby, where are you?" "I've been so worried. I'm at the police station." The words tasted like ash in his mouth. They're saying I stole things." But I didn't, Grandma. I swear I didn't. He heard her sharp intake of breath, followed by coughing. Lord have mercy. Are they letting you come home? Yeah, but... Ray swallowed hard. They're putting something on my ankle. I can't go far from home. And they're taking me to court next week. Jesus help us. Her voice was barely a whisper. My baby, my poor baby. The ride home in the patrol car was silent. They took him straight inside, where a technician waited with the ankle monitor. The device was heavier than it looked, the plastic edges already chafing against his skin. Don't try to remove it, the technician warned. Don't go beyond your permitted radius. Don't get it wet. Any violations, you go straight to detention. That night, Ray lay in bed, the ankle monitor a constant presence, impossible to ignore. Through the wall, he could hear his grandmother crying, trying to muffle the sound with her pillow. He touched the cold plastic around his ankle, feeling the small light pulsing green in the darkness. In a matter of hours, his whole life had shattered, and the pieces were still falling. The ankle monitor beeped at 6:45 a.m., reminding Ray of his first mandatory check-in. He pressed the acknowledgement button with trembling fingers, still not used to the device's weight after 3 days. Status confirmed, a robotic voice announced. Subject within permitted radius. Ray gritted his teeth. Subject, like he was some kind of lab experiment. His grandmother's voice drifted from the kitchen, weak but trying to sound cheerful. Breakfast is ready, baby. Coming, Grandma. Ray pulled his pant leg down over the monitor, but the bulge was still visible. You shouldn't be up cooking. She stood at the stove, one hand gripping the counter for support. Can't let my boy go to school hungry. The smell of instant oatmeal filled the small kitchen. Ray's stomach churned. He hadn't been able to keep much down since the arrest. The school called yesterday, his grandmother said quietly. While you were in your room. They want to meet with us. Ray stared at his bowl. I can't go more than 5 blocks. The school's too far. They're sending someone here. Mr. Thompson, the principal. The oatmeal turned to paste in Ray's mouth. Principal Thompson had always been fair to him before, but now, a knock at the door made them both jump. Ray's ankle monitor beeped again, a warning that he was approaching the edge of his permitted radius just by walking to the apartment's entrance. Mr. Thompson stood in the hallway, his usual suit replaced by casual clothes. His eyes went straight to Ray's ankle. Mrs. Williams, Raymond? He nodded. May I come in? They sat around the small kitchen table, the principal looking too big for their rickety chairs. Ray's grandmother offered him coffee, which he declined. I'll be direct, Thompson said. The school board has concerns. My grandson is innocent. Ray's grandmother's voice was firm despite her weakness. He hasn't been convicted of anything. Nevertheless, there are protocols. Thompson pulled out a folder. Raymond's file now includes a warning for suspicious behavior. His movements on campus will be restricted. He'll need to check in with security between classes. Ray's face burned. But I didn't do anything. Additionally, Thompson continued as if Ray hadn't spoken. Some parents have expressed concerns about their children's safety. Safety? Ray's grandmother's hand shook as she reached for her coffee cup. My Ray wouldn't hurt anybody. The board's decision is final. Thompson stood. Raymond can continue attending classes under these new restrictions, or what? Ray asked, though he already knew. Alternative education programs are available. After Thompson left, Ray's grandmother had another coughing fit. He helped her to bed, gave her the morning medicines, then faced the mirror in the bathroom. His school uniform hung loose on his thin frame. The ankle monitor's green light blinked steadily, visible even through his sock. He looked exactly the same as he had a week ago, but somehow everything was different. The walk to school took him right to the edge of his permitted radius. Every step made the monitor chirp softly, warning him not to go further. Conversation stopped when he entered the building. Security waved him over immediately. Arms out, the guard ordered. Turn around. The pat-down was thorough and humiliating. Students walked past, some pointing, others quickly looking away. Report here between every class, the guard said, handing Ray a bright orange pass. No exceptions. His first class was English. Ray had always sat in the back, next to his friend Marcus. Today, Marcus's seat was empty. Marcus is in a different class now, Mrs. Garcia said when Ray asked. She wouldn't meet his eyes. Take your assigned seat, please. Front row. By lunch, the whispers had become a constant backdrop. I heard he robbed old ladies. My mom says he's in a gang. Can't believe they let him come back. Ray sat alone, his food untouched. His phone buzzed, a text from Marcus. Sorry, man. Mom says I can't hang with you anymore. Nothing personal. The afternoon dragged. Between each class, Ray had to check in with security, the orange pass like a beacon announcing his status. Teachers watched him constantly. Other students gave him a wide berth in the hallways. After school, a social worker named Ms. Martinez came to their apartment. She asked endless questions, took notes, checked their refrigerator. Your grandmother's condition, she said, glancing at the pill bottles on the counter. It must be stressful, being her primary caregiver at your age. I take care of her fine, Ray said. We don't need help. The court will want to evaluate the stability of your home environment. She made another note. Given the circumstances, that evening, Ray found his grandmother watching the local news. His school photo was on the screen. Local teen charged in connection with a string of robberies. Sources say the suspect, 13-year-old Raymond Williams, will be tried as an adult. Ray grabbed the remote, turning off the TV. His grandmother was crying silently. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry. Don't you apologize. She pulled him close. The Lord knows the truth. We just have to trust in his plan. But later, alone in his room, Ray couldn't find any trust. The ankle monitor beeped, confirming his position for the 100th time that day. Outside, police sirens wailed. On his desk, homework waited, pointless now that his permanent record was stained. He touched the monitor again, its plastic surface warm from his body heat. One little device, and his whole world had shrunk to a 5-block radius. One accusation, and 13 years of being a good kid meant nothing. His phone buzzed. Another text from Marcus. Maybe after court stuff done we can hang again. Ray didn't reply. There was nothing to say. The mark on him wasn't just a monitor anymore. It was in every suspicious glance, every whispered conversation, every empty seat next to him. The night stretched ahead, full of beeps and check-ins, and the sound of his grandmother's breathing through the wall. Tomorrow would be the same, and the next day, and the next, until the trial. The courthouse loomed ahead, all granite and stern faces. Ray tugged at his borrowed tie, a donation from his neighbor Mr. Johnson, along with a suit jacket that hung off his shoulders like a tent. Remember, his public defender, Mr. Peters, muttered as they climbed the steps. Let me do the talking. Don't react, no matter what they say. Ray's grandmother followed slowly, leaning heavily on her cane. The morning air was cold, making her breathing more labored than usual. You okay, Grandma? Ray reached for her arm. I'm fine, baby. But her face was gray with exhaustion. The Lord will see us through. Inside, the metal detector beeped at Ray's ankle monitor. 3 security guards surrounded him immediately. It's a court-ordered monitor, Peters explained, showing paperwork. They waved them through, but their eyes followed Ray's every move. The courtroom was bigger than Ray expected, with high ceilings and wooden benches that seemed to stretch forever. They sat in the front row. Ray's ankle monitor chirped, earning glares from nearby court officers. All rise. Everyone stood as Judge Harrison entered, an older white man with steel-gray hair and reading glasses perched on his nose. He barely glanced at Ray before taking his seat. Preliminary hearing in the case of State versus Raymond Williams, the clerk announced. The defendant is present with counsel. The prosecutor stood, a sharp-faced woman in an expensive suit. Sarah Martinez for the state, Your Honor. The state is prepared to show evidence that the defendant engaged in a systematic pattern of theft targeting vulnerable victims, Martinez began. Security footage from multiple locations shows. Objection. Peters rose. The footage is inconclusive at best, Your Honor. The figure shown is barely identifiable. Save it for trial, Judge Harrison cut in. Ms. Martinez continue. Martinez played the security footage on a large screen. The image was grainy, showing someone Ray's height and build moving through various stores. The face was always turned away or obscured. That's not me, Ray whispered to Peters. I've never even been to those stores. Quiet, Peters hissed. Behind them, Ray heard his grandmother's breathing getting worse. The stress was affecting her. Martinez called her first witness, a store owner Ray had never seen before. And you're certain the defendant is the person you saw that day? Well, the man squinted at Ray. He matches the description. Young, black, tall for his age. Objection. Peters stood again. This identification is based solely on general physical characteristics that could match thousands of individuals. Overruled, Judge Harrison said without looking up from his notes. Ray's grandmother started coughing, deep, racking coughs that shook her whole body. The judge banged his gavel. Control that disruption. She needs her inhaler, Ray said, reaching for his grandmother's purse. Please, young man, sit down or I'll have you removed. Ray froze, torn between obeying and helping his grandmother. A court officer approached her. Ma'am, you'll need to step outside. No, Ray's grandmother wheezed. My boy needs me here. The coughing got worse. She clutched her chest, face contorted in pain. Call an ambulance, someone shouted. The next few minutes were chaos. Paramedics rushed in. Ray tried to follow them as they loaded his grandmother onto a stretcher, but officers held him back. Let me go with her. Please. She's all I have. Return to your seat, Judge Harrison ordered. This hearing will proceed. Your Honor, Peters interjected, given the circumstances, the defendant's presence is required. Continue, Ms. Martinez. Ray watched helplessly as they wheeled his grandmother away. Her hand reached toward him weakly before the doors swung shut. Martinez resumed presenting evidence. More grainy footage. More vague identifications. Ray barely heard any of it, his mind racing with worry about his grandmother. During a brief recess, Peters pulled him aside. The DA's office is offering a deal, he said quietly. Plead guilty to 2 counts of petty theft. Serve 6 months in juvenile detention instead of adult prison. But I didn't do anything. Ray's voice cracked. You have to believe me. What I believe doesn't matter. They have circumstantial evidence, multiple witness identifications. Based on what? That I'm black and tall? Peters sighed. Look, with an adult conviction, you're looking at years, not months. Think about your grandmother. We'll take care of her if you're gone that long. Ray's chest felt tight. Can I think about it? You have until tomorrow morning. After that, the deal's off the table. The rest of the hearing passed in a blur. More witnesses. More evidence. Ray's ankle monitor kept beeping, each sound a reminder of his situation. Finally, Judge Harrison spoke. Based on the evidence presented, I find probable cause to proceed with trial. The defendant will remain under current restrictions. Next hearing date is set for... Your Honor, Peters interrupted. My client needs to check on his grandmother's condition. The judge peered at Ray over his glasses. You have 1 hour. Any deviation from your monitoring schedule will result in immediate detention. Understood? Yes, sir. Ray practically ran from the courthouse, Peters struggling to keep up. The hospital was just within his permitted radius, but barely. The monitor beeped warnings with every step. The emergency room was crowded. A tired nurse checked her computer. Williams? She's in ICU. Stress-induced cardiac event. Ray's world tilted. Cardiac? You mean a heart attack? The doctor will explain. Room 412. His grandmother looked small in the hospital bed, tubes and wires everywhere. Her eyes fluttered open when he took her hand. Ray? Baby? Is that you? I'm here, Grandma. He tried to keep his voice steady. I'm right here. The trial. What happened? Don't worry about that now. You just rest. She squeezed his hand weakly. Whatever they offer you, don't admit to something you didn't do. Your integrity. That's all we really have. The monitor beeped. 30 minutes until he had to leave. Ray's throat felt tight. I don't know what to do, Grandma. If I don't take the deal... Trust in the truth, she whispered before drifting off to sleep. Ray sat there until the last possible moment, watching her breathe, the machines beeping steadily. Peters waited in the hallway. Have you decided about the deal? Ray looked at his grandmother's face, peaceful in sleep. Then at the ankle monitor, its light pulsing like a countdown. I need more time. Time's the one thing you don't have, Peters said. The DA wants an answer first thing tomorrow. Outside the hospital, the sun was setting. Ray had less than 15 minutes to get home before violating his monitoring schedule. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a physical thing. Plead guilty to something he didn't do and serve months, or risk years in adult prison. Tell the truth and maybe lose everything, or lie and save what little he had left. His ankle monitor beeped again. Time was running out. The school hallway stretched before Ray like a gauntlet. 3 days after his grandmother's hospitalization, he'd returned to class, only to find things had gotten worse. Check in, the security guard grunted, holding out his hand for Ray's orange pass. The morning pat-down had become routine, but it still made his skin crawl. Students pressed against the lockers as he passed, creating a bubble of empty space around him. Whispers followed in his wake. Did you hear? His grandma had a heart attack in court. Probably faked it to get sympathy. I heard he's going to prison. Ray kept his eyes forward, clutching his backpack strap so tight his knuckles went white. The ankle monitor chirped with each step, marking his passage like a countdown. His first class was chemistry. As he approached his usual lab station, his partner, James, grabbed his books and moved to another table. Mr. Carter, James called out to the teacher. I can't work with him anymore. My parents signed a note. The teacher sighed, gesturing to an empty station in the corner. Raymond, you'll work alone today. Ray set up his equipment with shaking hands, trying to ignore the stares boring into his back. The experiment required partners, but no one volunteered to join him. Between classes, his phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. Mom says UR court thing was on news. Said you almost killed UR grandma. That true? Ray shoved the phone back in his pocket without responding. His next class was gym, which meant changing in the locker room. As soon as he entered, conversations died. Hey, Williams, someone called out. Better not steal my wallet. Laughter erupted. Ray changed quickly, keeping his back to the wall. The ankle monitor felt heavier than ever under his gym shorts. Coach Evans split them into teams for basketball. Ray stood alone as captains picked players, until he was the only one left. He has to play, Evans said tiredly. Johnson's team, take Williams, but coach, just do it. No one passed to him during the game. When he did get the ball, the other team backed away dramatically. Hands up. Don't hurt us, they laughed. We don't want any trouble. Lunch was worst of all. Ray sat at his usual table, but within minutes, everyone else got up and moved. The cafeteria staff watched him suspiciously, as if he might try to steal extra food. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a number he didn't recognize. This is ADA Martinez. Consider the deal. Clock's ticking. The afternoon dragged on. In English class, they were reading To Kill a Mockingbird. The irony wasn't lost on Ray as Mrs. Garcia discussed false accusations and prejudice, carefully avoiding his eyes. After school, he headed straight to the hospital. His grandmother was awake but weak, tubes still snaking from her arms. How was school, baby? She asked, patting the bed beside her. Ray forced a smile. Fine. Everything's fine. But she saw right through him like always. Tell me the truth now. His voice cracked as he finally let it out. Nobody will talk to me, Grandma. They all think. They all believe. Come here. She pulled him close, letting him cry into her hospital gown. Let it out, baby. Just let it out. A nurse appeared in the doorway. Visiting hours are ending. Anne. She glanced at Ray's ankle monitor. You need to stay within your permitted radius. Ray wiped his eyes quickly. 5 more minutes? Please. Rules are rules. Outside the hospital, rain had started falling. Ray pulled his hood up, but it didn't help much. His phone buzzed again. Another text from the DA. Deal expires at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Make the smart choice. He was soaked by the time he reached their apartment building. Mr. Johnson from next door was checking his mail. Evening, Ray, he said cautiously, then hesitated. Listen, about the suit I loaned you. My wife thinks it's best if I get it back. I'll bring it tomorrow, Ray mumbled, heading for the stairs. And Ray, Johnson called after him. Maybe use the service elevator from now on? Some of the neighbors are concerned about. Well, you understand. In the apartment, Ray stood dripping in the dark kitchen. The fridge was nearly empty. He hadn't been able to work at Miller's Market since the arrest. Bills were piling up on the counter, red notices stark against white envelopes. His phone buzzed one more time. Marcus again. Mom says I should delete your number. Sorry, man. Hope you don't go to jail. Ray sank to the kitchen floor, the linoleum cold against his legs. The ankle monitor beeped its regular check-in, the sound echoing in the empty apartment. The DA's deal floated in his mind. 6 months in juvenile detention. A chance to put this behind him. His grandmother would be out of the hospital by then. Maybe people would forget. Maybe things could go back to normal. All he had to do was lie. A knock at the door made him jump. Through the peephole, he saw Ms. Martinez, the social worker, holding her clipboard. Raymond, I need to conduct another home visit. The court requires daily checks while your grandmother is hospitalized. Ray leaned his forehead against the door, eyes squeezed shut. Can we do it tomorrow? I'm afraid not. Open the door, please. The next hour was torture. Martinez opened every cabinet, checked every room, made notes about the empty fridge and unpaid bills. Your situation is becoming untenable, she said finally. Without a capable adult guardian, my grandmother will be home soon. Perhaps, Martinez said, writing something else down. But given her condition and your current legal situation, the court might feel a group home would be more appropriate. Ray's heart stopped. What? It's one option being considered. Unless, of course, your legal situation resolves itself quickly. She gave him a meaningful look. I understand the DA's office has made an offer? After she left, Ray sat in his grandmother's room, surrounded by her things. Her Bible lay open on the nightstand, bookmarked to Psalms. Her favorite sweater hung on the door. Everything smelled like her lavender lotion. His phone showed 8:43 p.m. In 12 hours, the deal would expire. The truth or his freedom, his integrity or his future. His grandmother's words echoed. Whatever they offer you, don't admit to something you didn't do. But as night fell and the empty apartment closed in around him, those words felt further and further away. The ankle monitor beeped again, reminding him of everything he had to lose. Tomorrow morning, he would have to choose. The courthouse clock showed 8:55 a.m. Ray sat on a hard wooden bench outside the courtroom, his borrowed suit feeling tighter than ever. Mr. Peters paced in front of him, checking his phone every few seconds. Last chance, Peters said, glancing at his watch. The DA's waiting in her office. One word from me, and this all goes away. Ray's ankle monitor beeped its morning check-in. Through the courthouse windows, he could see news vans parked outside. His case had become local news, the 13-year-old being tried as an adult. I didn't do it, Ray said, his voice barely a whisper. I can't lie. Peter stopped pacing. You understand what's at stake here? Adult court means adult time. Years, not months. I understand. At 8:59, Peters made one last call. He's not taking the deal? Yes, I've explained everything. No, he's adamant. The courtroom doors opened at 9 a.m. sharp. Ray's heart pounded as they entered. The room was packed. Reporters in the back, curious onlookers filling the benches. His grandmother's hospital bed was still empty. All rise. Judge Harrison entered, looking more severe than ever. He surveyed the crowded courtroom before sitting. Are both parties ready to proceed? Yes, Your Honor. ADA Martinez stood, perfectly pressed and confident. The state is ready. Peters shuffled his papers. Defense is ready, Your Honor. Very well. Ms. Martinez, your opening statement. Martinez approached the jury box, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. Ray got his first good look at the jury. 12 faces, none of them looking like him or anyone from his neighborhood. Ladies and gentlemen, Martinez began, this case is about trust. Trust violated. Trust betrayed. The evidence will show that the defendant, Raymond Williams, systematically targeted elderly and vulnerable victims. Ray watched the jurors' faces as Martinez painted him as a calculated criminal. Some nodded. Others took notes. A few glanced at him with barely concealed disgust. The security footage, while not perfect, shows a clear pattern. The witness testimonies you'll hear will confirm that pattern. And most importantly, you'll see how the defendant used his job at a local market to identify potential victims. Objection. Peters stood. Prejudicial speculation. Overruled. Continue, Ms. Martinez. The prosecution's opening went on for 45 minutes. When Peters finally stood for the defense, he seemed small in comparison. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice less confident. The state's case is built on assumptions and generalizations. They want you to see a stereotype, not a 13-year-old boy who, a juror in the front row, actually rolled his eyes. Others had stopped taking notes. The first witness was Detective Rogers, who'd led the investigation. We identified a pattern, Rogers testified, pointing to a map. Multiple thefts, all within a 5-block radius of Miller's Market, all targeting elderly victims. And what led you to the defendant? Martinez asked. Physical description matched. Tall, thin African-American male, young. Plus, his position at the market gave him access to potential victims. Access? Peters objected. He helped people with their groceries. Objection overruled, Judge Harrison said. Continue, Detective. Rogers clicked through security camera footage. Grainy images showed someone Ray's height and build, but the face was never clear. In your expert opinion, Detective, is this the defendant? The build, movement patterns, and timing all match. Plus, we have witness identifications. Ray's ankle monitor chirped loudly in the quiet courtroom. Several jurors frowned. Your Honor, Peters stood. May we approach? At the bench, Peters argued quietly with Martinez and the judge. Ray caught phrases like prejudicial effect and jury bias. Judge Harrison shook his head. The monitor stays. The jury will disregard any sounds it makes. But Ray saw their faces. The monitor marked him as guilty before any verdict. The next witness was Mrs. Chun from the corner store. Ray's heart sank. He'd helped her with groceries dozens of times. Mrs. Chun, Martinez began, did you identify the defendant in a photo lineup? Photo looked like him, Mrs. Chun said hesitantly. Same height, same build. But did you see his face during the alleged theft? No, was wearing hood, but same clothes he always wear. Peters cross-examined, pointing out the vagueness of her identification, but the damage was done. By lunch break, Ray felt crushed. In the courthouse bathroom, he splashed water on his face, trying not to cry. Tough morning? Ray spun around. A court officer stood watching him. Better hurry back, the officer said. Judge Harrison hates delays. The afternoon brought more witnesses. Store owners, security guards, each identification more vague than the last, but all pointing to Ray. The suspect was tall for his age. African-American male, thin build, looked just like him, but I didn't see his face clearly. Peters objected repeatedly to the parade of circumstantial evidence, but Judge Harrison overruled him every time. The state is establishing a pattern, counselor. I'll allow it. During a brief recess, Ray's phone buzzed. A text from the hospital. Your grandmother's condition has stabilized. She's asking for you. But he couldn't leave. The trial would continue until 5 p.m., and then his monitoring schedule required him to go straight home. The final witness of the day was the detective who'd processed Ray's arrest. Did the defendant have any stolen items in his possession? No, the detective admitted. But his pockets contained cash consistent with. Objection. Peters jumped up. The money was his legitimate earnings. Sustained, Judge Harrison said tiredly. Jury will disregard that last statement. But Ray saw them writing in their notebooks. Every piece of his life, his job, his clothes, even the money he earned honestly, was being twisted into evidence against him. At 5 p.m., Judge Harrison called a recess until morning. And counselors? Pick up the pace tomorrow. This court's schedule is full. Outside the courtroom, Peters looked defeated. It's not over, he told Ray. But you should prepare yourself. The jury's body language. Ray nodded numbly. He'd seen their faces. Their minds were already made up. The walk home felt longer than usual. His phone kept buzzing. Messages from the hospital, from social services, from numbers he didn't recognize. He ignored them all. In the empty apartment, Ray stood at his grandmother's bedroom door. Her Bible still lay open on the nightstand. He picked it up, feeling the worn leather cover. The ankle monitor beeped its evening check-in. Outside, a police siren wailed. Tomorrow, He'd have to go back and face those 12 strangers who saw him not as a 13-year-old boy, but as everything they'd been taught to fear. Ray opened the Bible randomly, needing something, anything to hold on to. His eyes fell on a highlighted verse, "The truth shall set you free." But as night settled over Brooklyn and Ray lay alone in his bed, those words felt like a cruel joke. The truth hadn't set him free. The truth had put him in an ankle monitor. The truth had put his grandmother in the hospital. The truth was destroying everything he loved. Tomorrow, the trial would continue, and the truth seemed further away than ever. The second day of trial started with Peters looking more nervous than ever. He pulled Ray aside in the courthouse hallway, his tie already crooked at 8:30 a.m. "The prosecution rests today," he whispered. "Then it's our turn. I've been thinking, maybe you should testify." Ray's stomach clenched. "You said I shouldn't. That was before we saw the jury. They've heard from everyone except you. Right now, you're just—" Peters gestured vaguely, a silent figure in an ankle monitor. Through the courthouse windows, Ray saw more news vans arriving. The story had grown. Local papers called it a test case for juvenile justice reform. "What?" Ray's voice cracked. He started again. "What would I have to say?" "The truth. Your truth. Why you were at the market that day. What you actually do there." Peters checked his watch. "But we need to decide now. Judge Harrison wants to finish this case today." Before Ray could answer, a commotion erupted at the courthouse entrance. His heart stopped when he saw who it was. His grandmother, in a wheelchair, being pushed by a hospital nurse. "Baby," she called out, her voice weak but determined. "I'm here." Ray ran to her, ignoring the bailiff's warnings. She looked fragile in her hospital gown, covered by a thin robe, but her eyes were clear. "You shouldn't be here," he said, taking her hand. "The doctor said—" "Hush now." She squeezed his fingers. "My place is with my boy." The bailiffs led her wheelchair into the courtroom, placing her in the front row. Ray could feel her presence behind him as Judge Harrison entered and everyone rose. "Ms. Martinez," the judge said, "call your final witness." The prosecution's last witness was a police analyst who'd studied the security footage. Using height markers and gait analysis, the analyst pointed to a screen. "We can establish that the subject matches the defendant's physical parameters." Peters' cross-examination was brief. "But you cannot positively identify my client from these images, correct?" "Not with absolute certainty, no. Nothing further." "The state rests, Your Honor." Judge Harrison turned to Peters. "Defense may proceed." Peters stood. "Your Honor, the defense calls Raymond Williams." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Ray's ankle monitor beeped as he walked to the witness stand, every eye following him. "Raise your right hand," the clerk instructed. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" Ray's voice shook. "I do." The wooden chair felt hard and cold. Under the fluorescent lights, Ray could see every face in the jury box clearly now. Some looked surprised. Maybe they hadn't realized how young he really was. "State your name for the record," Peters began. "Raymond James Williams." "How old are you, Raymond?" 13. "Tell us about your job at Miller's Market." Ray took a deep breath, remembering his grandmother's presence behind him. "I help elderly customers with their groceries. Carrying bags, reaching high shelves, reading small print on labels. Mr. and Mrs. Miller let me work there because—" His voice caught. "Because a lot of older people in the neighborhood need help." "And how much do you earn doing this?" "Maybe $8 or $10 a day. Depends how many customers need help." "What do you do with that money?" Ray glanced at his grandmother. "My grandma, she's sick. Diabetes. Her medicine costs more than her disability check covers. I try to help." Peters nodded. "The prosecution has shown security footage from various stores. Were you in those stores?" "No, sir. Just Miller's Market. I couldn't go far. Had to stay close to help Grandma. And now?" Ray touched his ankle monitor. "Can't go more than 5 blocks from home." Martinez stood. "Your Honor, I'll allow it." "Continue, Mr. Peters." "Raymond, why didn't you take the plea deal?" "Objection." Martinez jumped up. "The defendant's plea negotiations are not admissible." "Sustained." Judge Harrison frowned. "Jury will disregard." Peters changed course. Raymond, why are you here today? Ray looked at the jury, his heart pounding. Because I didn't do what they say I did. Because the truth matters. My grandma taught me that, even though telling the truth might mean objection leading, sustained. Peters turned to the judge. No further questions. Martinez approached the stand, her heels clicking ominously. Mr. Williams, you claim you work at Miller's Market to help elderly customers. Isn't it true this gives you access to observe their shopping habits? Their vulnerabilities? No. I help them because, just yes or no, Mr. Williams, no. Yet multiple witnesses identified someone matching your exact description. They said they saw someone tall and black. Ray's voice rose. That's not an identification. That's, Your Honor, Martinez smiled. Please instruct the witness to only answer the questions asked. Judge Harrison nodded. Mr. Williams, you must wait for a question. Martinez continued her cross-examination for what felt like hours. Every question twisted Ray's words, made his honest work sound suspicious. Isn't it true you're desperate for money? Wouldn't you do anything to help your grandmother? How convenient that none of the security footage shows a clear face. Ray gripped the witness stand, trying to stay calm. His ankle monitor kept beeping, making jurors wince. No further questions, Martinez finally said. Redirect? Judge Harrison asked Peters. Peters stood. Raymond, is there anything else you want to tell the jury? Ray looked at the 12 faces that would decide his fate, then at his grandmother, who nodded slightly. I know what this looks like, he said quietly. I'm tall and black and poor. The footage shows someone who could be me. The witnesses say it might be me. And yeah, I need money for my grandma's medicine. He took a shaky breath. But I didn't do this. I help people at the market because it's right. Because they remind me of my grandma. Because the courtroom doors burst open. Stop. Stop everything. Every head turned. In the doorway stood Mrs. Miller from the market, out of breath and clutching her purse. Your Honor, she called out. I have something you need to see. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Bailiffs moved toward Mrs. Miller, but Judge Harrison held up his hand. Order! His gavel cracked against the wooden block. Who are you, ma'am? Mrs. Miller straightened her flowered dress, clutching a manila envelope. Sarah Miller, Your Honor. I own Miller's Market with my husband, and I have proof that boy is innocent. Martinez shot to her feet. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The defense's witness list. Mrs. Miller wasn't on our list, Peters admitted, looking as surprised as everyone else. But given the nature of, approach the bench, Judge Harrison ordered. All parties. Ray watched from the witness stand as the lawyers huddled with the judge, their whispers urgent. His grandmother reached out and squeezed his hand as he passed, returning to his seat. After 5 minutes of heated discussion, Judge Harrison addressed the courtroom. Given the extraordinary circumstances, I'll allow this testimony. Ms. Miller, please take the stand. Ray held his breath as Mrs. Miller was sworn in. She'd removed her reading glasses, wiping them nervously on her dress. Now then, Judge Harrison said, what evidence do you have? Mrs. Miller opened her envelope with shaking fingers. I read about Ray's case in the paper, about the security footage, and I remembered. She pulled out several sheets of paper. We installed new cameras last month. High definition. They store footage for 30 days. Martinez's face tightened. Your Honor. Let her finish, counselor. I went back and checked the dates. Mrs. Miller continued. Every single time those other stores were robbed, Ray was at my market. Here. She handed the papers to the bailiff. They were screenshots, crystal clear, showing Ray helping elderly customers with their groceries. Each image had a timestamp. I brought the full footage too. Mrs. Miller patted her purse. It's all there. Every minute. You can see him working, helping people. He's not just in the background. He's right there, clear as day. Peters jumped up. Your Honor, I move to admit these as defense exhibits. On what grounds? Martinez countered. This evidence wasn't properly. I'll allow it, Judge Harrison said. But I want that footage authenticated immediately. Bailiff, get someone from IT up here. While they waited for the tech expert, Mrs. Miller continued testifying. Ray's been working in my store for almost a year. Every morning, rain or shine. Never asked for more money, even when I offered. Just wanted to help. Did you pay him under the table? Martinez asked sharply. Objection. Peters called. Relevance? I'll rephrase. Martinez approached the stand. Ms. Miller, isn't it true you employed a minor without proper documentation? Mrs. Miller's chin lifted. I didn't employ anyone. Ray volunteered to help our elderly customers. They gave him tips because they wanted to, because he was kind to them, because he'd read labels for their diabetes diets, just like he does for his grandmother. The tech expert arrived, a young man with thick glasses. He examined the footage on Mrs. Miller's USB drive. The timestamps are authentic, he reported after several minutes. No signs of manipulation, and the quality is significantly higher than the footage previously shown in court. Judge Harrison examined the screenshots. The timestamps match the times of the reported thefts? To the minute, Your Honor, Mrs. Miller said. Ray couldn't have been in two places at once. Martinez tried another angle. Perhaps the defendant had an accomplice. Objection. Peters stood. Speculation. Sustained. Mrs. Miller wasn't finished. There's more. After I read about the case, I started asking our regular customers about Ray. They all wanted to come testify. I have letters. She reached for her purse again. Your Honor, Martinez interrupted. This is becoming a circus. These letters would be hearsay. The letters aren't admissible, Judge Harrison agreed. But Ms. Miller, you can tell us what you personally observed about the defendant's character. Mrs. Miller's eyes filled with tears. That boy. I've watched him count pennies to buy his grandmother's medicine. Seen him skip lunch so he could save up. One time, Mrs. Chun from the corner store fell outside our market. Ray sat with her for 2 hours until her son could come, reading to her from her Chinese newspaper, even though he didn't understand a word. Ray felt his own eyes burning. He hadn't known Mrs. Miller had seen all that. The other day, she continued, before this nightmare started, I offered Ray a regular job. Better pay. He said no. Said he needed to keep his schedule flexible for his grandmother's doctor appointments. She looked directly at the jury. That's who Ray Williams is. Not some thief in grainy footage. A boy trying to take care of his grandmother, one grocery bag at a time. Martinez's cross-examination was aggressive but couldn't shake Mrs. Miller's testimony. No, I can't prove he was helping people out of pure kindness. No, I don't follow him when he leaves the store. Yes, I'm absolutely certain about the timestamps. Finally, Martinez sat down, her face tight with frustration. Judge Harrison called a recess to review the new evidence. In the hallway, Peters looked like a different person. This changes everything, he said, straightening his tie. The timestamps alone create reasonable doubt. And Mrs. Miller's testimony about your character. Ray barely heard him. He was watching Mrs. Miller talk to his grandmother, both women wiping tears. Why? He asked when Mrs. Miller came over. Why did you do all this? She cupped his face in her soft hands. Because it was right. And because... She smiled sadly. You remind me of my son. He would have been about your age if... She cleared her throat. Well, the truth matters, doesn't it? When court resumed, the footage was played in its entirety. The difference in quality was stark. While the robbery footage was grainy and inconclusive, Mrs. Miller's camera showed Ray clearly, helping elderly customers, reading labels, carrying bags, checking prices. The timestamps are conclusive, the tech expert confirmed. The defendant was physically present at Miller's market during every reported theft. Martinez made one last attempt. The defense has offered no explanation for who actually committed these crimes. Objection. Peters stood. The defense doesn't have to prove who did commit the crimes, only that our client did not. Sustained. Judge Harrison turned to the jury. Given this new evidence, does the prosecution wish to proceed? Martinez stood slowly. Your Honor, in light of the timestamps proving the defendant's whereabouts, the state moves to dismiss all charges. The words hung in the air for a moment. Ray's grandmother let out a sob of relief. Motion granted, Judge Harrison said. Mr. Williams, please approach the bench. Ray stood on shaky legs. His ankle monitor beeped as he walked forward, but this time, nobody winced. Young man, the judge said, looking at him directly for the first time. It appears a serious mistake has been made. This court apologizes for the ordeal you've endured. He shuffled some papers. Bailiff, Please remove the monitoring device. Mr. Williams is free to go. The courtroom erupted in applause. Ray felt the ankle monitor being removed, the weight lifting from his leg. His grandmother wheeled over, pulling him into a fierce hug. I told you, she whispered. I told you the truth would set you free. Mrs. Miller joined them, along with Peters and even some of the jurors who wanted to shake Ray's hand. Martinez had disappeared. Through the courthouse windows, Ray could see reporters gathering. There would be questions, cameras, more stories about his case. But for now, he just stood with his grandmother and Mrs. Miller, his ankle finally free, the truth finally heard. The morning after the trial, Ray woke up reaching for his ankle monitor. His fingers found only bare skin. It hadn't been a dream. Ray? His grandmother called from the kitchen. Come on out here, baby. She was sitting at the table, looking stronger than she had in weeks. The morning sun through the window caught the silver in her hair. In front of her was the morning paper. Look at this. She pushed it toward him. Ray's own face stared back from the front page. The headline read, Justice Served. Teen cleared of all charges. Below was a picture of him leaving the courthouse with his grandmother and Mrs. Miller. They're calling it a wake-up call for the justice system, his grandmother said. About jumping to conclusions. About seeing what they expect to see instead of the truth. Before Ray could respond, someone knocked at the door. He opened it to find Marcus standing there, shuffling his feet. Hey, Marcus said, not meeting his eyes. I saw the news. Ray waited. I'm sorry, Marcus burst out. I should have believed you. Should have stuck by you. My mom, she wants to apologize too. Says you can come over any time. Thanks, Ray said quietly. The word felt small for everything that had happened. So, we cool? Ray thought about the lonely lunches, the empty seats, the whispers. I need time, he said finally. But maybe we can start over. More visitors came throughout the morning. Mr. Johnson brought back the suit, freshly cleaned. Mrs. Chun from the corner store brought dumplings and tears. Even some teachers called to apologize. Around noon, Peters arrived with news. The DA's office is facing an investigation, he said, accepting a cup of coffee from Ray's grandmother. Martinez has been reassigned. And? He smiled. Judge Harrison wants to see you. Why? Ray's stomach tightened. Nothing bad. Trust me. The courthouse felt different without the ankle monitor, without the weight of accusations. Judge Harrison met them in his chambers rather than the courtroom. Mr. Williams, he said, gesturing to a chair. Please sit. You too, Mrs. Williams. The judge looked different in his office, more human somehow. Family photos lined his desk. A baseball sat in a display case. What happened to you was wrong, he said directly. The system failed you. And while an apology isn't enough, I hope this might help. He handed Ray an envelope. Inside was a letter on official stationery. It's a scholarship, Judge Harrison explained. Full ride to any high school in the city. Private, public, wherever you want to go. And a college fund to follow. Ray's hand shook. I don't understand. I have a foundation, the judge said, for promising young people who've been wronged by the system. Your case, it reminded me why I started it. Ray's grandmother wiped her eyes. Thank you, Your Honor. But why? Because change has to start somewhere. Judge Harrison leaned forward. Ray, you stood by the truth when it would have been easier to lie. You showed more integrity at 13 than most people show in a lifetime. The least we can do is make sure you have every opportunity going forward. They left the courthouse into bright sunlight. Ray's phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Miller. Store opens at 7 tomorrow. Our regular customers miss you. And this time, we're doing everything properly. Work papers, fair wage, the whole thing. If you're interested, at school the next day, everything was different. Principal Thompson called an assembly to publicly apologize. Ray's warning was removed from his record. Teachers smiled. Students who had avoided him now wanted to sit nearby. Here you're going to private school, one kid said during lunch. Haven't decided yet, Ray answered. He was still getting used to walking normally without the monitor's weight throwing off his balance. After school, he went to the hospital for his grandmother's final checkup. Blood pressure's much better, the doctor said. Amazing what reducing stress can do. But keep taking your medicine. Mrs. Williams, no more skipping doses to save money. The Judges Foundation is helping with medical bills too, Ray's grandmother said, squeezing his hand. The Lord provides. They walked home slowly, enjoying the ability to take their time, to go where they wanted. The 5-block radius that had been Ray's prison was now just another part of Brooklyn. At Miller's Market, everything looked the same but felt different. The security cameras that had saved him gleamed in their corners. Mrs. Miller had his work papers ready. Same schedule as before? She asked. Or do you need different hours with the new school coming up? Maybe a little later in the mornings, Ray said, so I can help Grandma with breakfast first. Mrs. Miller smiled. Whatever works for you, dear. Oh, and Mrs. Chin asked if you could still help her on Thursdays. Says no one else reads the diabetes information right. That evening, Ray sat with his grandmother on their small balcony. The summer air was warm, filled with city sounds, traffic, music, children playing. Normal sounds. Free sounds. You know what the newspaper didn't say? His grandmother asked suddenly. What's that? That my boy was always innocent. That he was always good. The truth didn't make you free, baby. The truth just showed everyone else what I always knew. Ray looked out over Brooklyn, his ankle feeling light, his future suddenly wide open. Below, elderly Mrs. Chun was shuffling home with her shopping. Tomorrow, he'd help her with those bags. Not because he had to, but because it was right. You think things will be different now? He asked. His grandmother took his hand. Some things will change. The scholarship, the job, the medical bills, those are blessings. But the important things? She smiled. The important things about you were always true. The world just needed to catch up and see them. Ray's phone buzzed with another text from Marcus. Basketball at the park tomorrow? Like old times? Maybe not exactly like old times, Ray thought. But maybe that was okay. Maybe something new could be better. He looked at his grandmother, her face peaceful in the evening light. At the newspaper with his story. At his bare ankle. At the acceptance letters from schools already arriving. The truth had cost him something, but it had given back more. Ready to go in? His grandmother asked as the sun set. Not yet, Ray said softly. Let's just sit here a while. We're free to do that now. And they were. Free to sit. Free to choose. Free to be exactly who they'd been all along. The truth had finally been heard. And in Brooklyn, the evening settled soft around them, full of possibilities, full of tomorrow.